those who have just joined, thank you again for coming along. I know it's a very, very busy time of year, so very much appreciated. My name is Matt East. I'm Learning Technologies Lead here at Talis, and today's community webinar is around deepening student engagement with Talis Elevate. So you can all see my screen, I believe, and what I wanted to outline today really was just a quick reflection on what we covered in the last webinar around introducing Elevate to your students and sharing some of the activity that some of our community have been undertaking following that webinar. I'm then going to touch a bit on, for me, the starting point around increasing student engagement, which is actually the point of learning design. I'm going to then move on to some practical action and examples from the community, and just a few final thoughts that we've observed, or I've observed over the last month, really, that I think are kind of worth sharing. Just some ideas and some approaches that some of our community are taking here. So as ever, I'm going to start this with a bit of a caveat in that, firstly, well, we're sharing this, we're recording this, and we are sharing this, and please feel free to share this recording with any of your colleagues, and likewise share the link for this community webinar with anyone who is using Elevate or isn't at the moment. I really try and focus a lot of this guidance that we provide not specifically on Talis Elevate. For me, it's really important that regardless of the tool you're using, the approaches and the recommendations that we're making should be fairly transferable to other systems. So I'd like to think that a lot of this, you can use with whatever technologies you're using, or even if you're not using technologies for for any sort of independent activity. A lot of this is based on advice from the community, from members of the academic community who are using Talis Elevate in anger. And in this webinar, I'm actually giving some examples from some of our new users who are testing a couple of new hypotheses around how to increase engagement with students. And as ever, this is not necessarily a to-do list for you that I recommend you follow. This is a shopping list of ideas that you hopefully you can you'll grab some some value from in a specific area. As ever as well, please do keep comments and questions and stuff flying through in the webinar tool itself. I will attempt to respond to those as soon as possible. So as I said, starting with a reminder, last month I delivered a session on introducing Talis Elevate to your students, and if you weren't able to watch that, it is available online and it's worth having a look at. Even if you have already started using Elevate, there's a couple of suggestions and recommendations in there that you may be able to use later on in the term as well. But just to recap, some of the things that we recommend really, and again, this is consistent with any tool you use really, introducing it early so the students are used to using this from the kind of start of the module, and be really clear with the students on how you want them to interact with it, but also how you're planning to interact with it. Making it really clear to your students, for example, if you are going to be actively responding to all the contributions, or actually if you're going to say nothing. If students know that that's the case, then at least their expectations will be set from the starting point. I always recommend icebreakers as a way to introduce these tools, just so students functionally know how to use systems. And I think from a kind of a cultural perspective, really, I guess for your course community, trying to encourage our students that there is no such thing as a stupid question is absolutely key for a tool that's based around collaborative learning and student support. And I've seen some really great examples actually where first year students have felt that they've had the confidence to actually say, I don't understand this, can someone help out? And their peers have really helped reposition their knowledge and understanding. And I think we'll all agree that's a brilliant thing to see. So I just wanted to reflect on a couple of the examples that have come from the community really. I always really try and recommend introducing a kind of an accessible conversation around the subject matter you're covering in the module. So the example on the left here from Fran Garrett-Cole, she's teaching a fundamentals of psychology module at Bangor University. It's a cohort of around 300 students first year, and there's a very wide-ranging knowledge on the fundamentals and the historic elements of psychology, so things like Freudian theory and that kind of thing. So, and actually, as we will probably all know, a lot of that has come into question over the more recent years. So actually what Fran has done is introduce this topic in just a video, just actually a live recording of a kind of for and against debate, giving both sides of the perspective on Freud and some of the theories that he put forward. just to get the students actually thinking about the subject matter at a very early point. But critically, this also introduced students to how to use the technology, which I think is great. And taking it slightly more into kind of a fun and, I guess, hello, meet your colleagues kind of approach. Suzanne Faulkner from Strathclyde University teaches on a prosthetics and orthotics module, which is primarily master's level. And actually, she got the students to play head, shoulders, knees, and toes, which I thought was brilliant, and obviously somewhat related to the subject matter as well. So this was introducing the image annotation features within Talis Elevate, but what she also got students to do was put down their initials, so that for future activity, students knew in other systems who was contributing, who was speaking, and it gave the opportunity to just introduce each other to the whole course, which I thought was a really nice idea. And we've got about 40 students on this module, and as you can see, there's a lot of annotations that have been made, and we saw some contributions and conversation occurring. I believe this was also done synchronously in a Zoom call. So, as with any good practice, really, the good practice within the teaching and learning domain starts from the learning design perspective, and I don't think that student engagement is any different there, really. If we want students to play an active role in the learning journey, we need to be designing in opportunities and activities, really, and capabilities that students can adopt and bring into the module at any point, really. So for me, this kind of all starts with, actually at the point of design. And I'm not going to preach to all of you about constructive alignment, but for me, this is, an absolutely fundamental part of learning design, really, and setting up the course to be as effective as possible. And actually making sure that the learning outcomes are the kind of driving force. What we actually want our students to leave the module knowing. It needs to be at the heart of everything that we decide, really. But the great thing about constructive alignment is that it causes you to question everything you're doing, and to ensure that the activities and the assessments all feed into the goal of what we want our students to learn. And for me, I've given some examples on the left-hand side of the kind of phrases that I've often used with students in the past that relate to what constructive alignment enables. So how this is why we're doing this, because it will help you with your knowledge and understanding in these key areas. The activities that we're doing will help you towards the assessment tasks, and and also another sort of area that I throw in quite regularly is just how we're actually going to adjust our teaching based on the contributions that you're making throughout the course. And that doesn't directly feed into constructive alignment, but it's a thing that I often recommend you do, and we'll touch a lot more on that in next month's webinar around the use of analytical insight. Why are we doing all this? Well, we all want our students to progress through the learning ladder, as some people will call it, and actually develop those kind of high level thinking skills. And however we can get our students to kind of move up that ladder, and you'll be very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, I'm sure. We should be building these kind of concepts and these capabilities into every part of our teaching, really. And what I'm going to try and do today is give you an example of that kind of staggering that can be taken throughout a 12-week course or a 24-week course, starting from that kind of just remembering knowledge, and then demonstrating an understanding of the subject matter, and moving up to kind of critical analysis and evaluation of what others are doing. And actually, what I used historically is Gilly Salmon's 5-stage model, also known as Carpe Diem. I find this is a really good way to articulate the kind of scaffolding and to really think about that structure of progression through a course. I mean, this has historically been focused on for online delivery, but actually I think this can apply to face-to-face teaching as well. But obviously, right now, we're talking in a kind of hybrid and progressively more online environment. And I think this is a really good model for kind of challenging yourself on the stages of moving up that learning ladder that I just showed from Bloom's taxonomy. So what I want to try and do today is give some examples of that progression throughout a module. So starting off from the community on some practical ideas, I mentioned about these icebreakers, and I think that this is a key thing for getting students using the tool, but also more importantly, I guess, really getting an understanding of how the course is going to run and how and what the expectations are. And that could be everything around what you expect from student engagement from a starting point, but also setting up that kind of the values of the course community you're trying to create. If you want students to be co-creators of knowledge throughout the course, make that really clear. If you want students to challenge each other, make that really clear. If you actually just want students to debate every single week, make that really clear. And I think, as I've mentioned already, having that very clear understanding of this is how I, as the academic, am going to contribute to this course as well, for me is absolutely essential. And when I've looked at when I've done retrospectives on modules I've helped design in the past, one of the clear things that's come out is around communication. And as we'll all recognise in the National Student Survey and things like that, communication is often an area that many institutions fall down on. And I think, from my personal perspective, a lot of that relates to setting out the expectations around engagement from academics as well. And where academics have done that on a number of courses using Talis Elevate, we've seen that actually, because students understand that the academics will only draw on the contributions in a seminar, for example, they're not expecting a response. They're tailoring their questioning, they're asking their peers more than directing stuff at academics, etc. For me, building that community is an absolute core tenet in that 5-stage model, and giving students the opportunity to feed in on their own personal experiences and to it starts it builds that kind of foundation on getting students to contribute and support each other. And I think one of the things that really jumped out of me was from one of our users in the US, an academic called Jesse Stommel, where he, in his module syllabus, as they call it, he makes it incredibly clear to the students that the whole learning experience is going to be cooperative. The course is fundamentally built around collaborative learning, and actually, in many ways, the contributions of peers becomes as valuable as the resource itself. And I think what really has chimed with me in the kind of methodology that Jesse has taken is that the course is quite organic. The course grows and evolves through the contributions that students make, and that could be as simple as a student saying, actually, I really don't like engaging with this kind of academic literature. I prefer engaging with YouTube videos, for example, or actually students bringing alternative theories or modernized literature or research to the table, and then that becoming a core part of the next stage of activity and resource usage that the academic is driving forward. I think that's for me that's a fabulous example of students as partners, and I think many of us will be aware of the concepts of students as partners and student partnership in general, really. And actually, a couple of approaches that we've seen working quite well here are things like diagnostic learning, for example. Setting the landscape very early on in your module around getting a better understanding of where your students are as a community, where their knowledge and understanding is strong and where it's potentially lacking, but also giving that opportunity for your students to contribute to each other's to learning. So this is an example from Jasper Schatz at the University of Lincoln, where he created these case studies for social work courses, and he was asking students to contribute on their own kind of thoughts on how they would approach this case study in the real world. And actually, he was taking a very hands-on approach. He was feeding back to every single student, but he actively encouraged students to respond to each other on their own experiences over the duration of the module. And for this kind of thing, I kind of recommend that you use this as almost like a sense check every few weeks, just to see if you can observe any kind of change in students' knowledge and understanding, the students' approach to the subject matter that you're covering. Obviously, this works much better in kind of smaller cohort sizes. This probably wouldn't work particularly well for a cohort of 200 students, but this idea of getting a kind of a sense check on the general feelings of the community, I think at an early point and then progressively later on, can be really valuable. One of the things I really like, or an approach I find really quite diverse, I guess you could say, is the concept of crowdsourcing. So fundamentally, this is opening up opportunities for your students to bring their own findings, thoughts, etc., directly into the content you're teaching with. But actually, what I really like about this is that there are so many different approaches that you can take here. By simply asking students to go and find X or Y, that can help you as an academic community, build up a much better or a much wider, collection and bank of resources that you could use to, I don't know, modernise the conversation that you're delivering within your teaching, to bring in a completely different perspective in the subject matter that could be very valuable for sparking some discussion and debate. I think actually there's a huge amount of value in mixing up the modality as well. Asking students, for example, to find a podcast or a video or some other form of content that backs up a viewpoint within the subject matter is a really good way of getting students to think about the content to a much deeper level, but also really useful for practicing things like information skills, searching for content, categorizing content, being critical on that content. And for me, that the great value for students here is that, and we've heard this time and time again from our student users, when it comes back to, for example, writing assignments, students have suddenly got this huge bibliography that they can draw on, based on the contributions that their colleagues have made, which is fantastic. That's a really great thing to see. And I come back to the point I was making from Jesse's contributions earlier. This also will allow you to make adjustments to your teaching based on the contributions that students have made. So, for example, if you see that most of your students are sharing media-based content, that could you give you the opportunity to ask why. You could adjust some of the delivery or even the content you're covering actually based on the things that students are sharing. And we've seen that from a colleague called Dr. Toby Carter at Anglia Ruskin, who's shared a really good example in a blog post of how he's adjusted his teaching based on the contributions his students have made. And just to give a couple of kind of other practical areas, really, this kind of crowdsourcing works really well for things like decolonization activity. We've seen this at Goldsmiths University, where Elevate was used specifically for that type of decolonization. Find a resource that comes from a Black author, or comes from an author from the nation that they're talking about. All of these kind of things. There's a huge array of uses that you can make there, and obviously the spectrum of decolonization activity is pretty broad. As I've mentioned already, I think this has got some really good opportunities for supporting information skills and information literacy, particularly if you're asking students to cite the resources they're sharing in in your citation style. I think this works really well, and there's something that we often struggle with as a community, getting our students to focus effort into citation, correct citation, information skills, etc. And for me, this is embedding criticality in within the absolute heart of everything we're doing. And again, I think that's something that, particularly for first-year students, we really strive to get students focusing on that critical thinking, that critical analysis, that critical challenging. And these kind of concepts can work really nicely for that. I wanted to bring in an example from Dr. Chris Headley at the University of Lincoln. We haven't had many examples from computer science and computer gaming in Talis Elevate recently, but Chris is starting to use Elevate for a very specific use case. He has access to a book called the PCG book, which is an open access piece of content available, where the chapters are downloadable as PDFs. And he's using each of those chapters within Elevate and asking students to effectively reflect on the positive and negative experiences relating to each element of that subject matter. Chris has referred to this as the kind of core reference manual for his subject, and he's really asking students to bring in their own experiences, even down to things like techniques that they've used to in the example that's shown on the right, to optimize search or to whatever it is. But he's getting students to actually co-construct their kind of support here. So if a student has said, I've really struggled with X using this piece of software, he's actively encouraging the other students on the course to suggest alternatives, to suggest what they have found to be really successful or really effective. And critically, I think for me, Chris is following the classic examples of constructive alignment here. So the students every week will literally be working through the next stage within this content. So this will become a kind of core part, almost like a reflective journal as part of this module. And I think that's a really valuable kind of retrospective to build into this subject. And what's exciting, I think, for me here is it's ensuring that the concept of reflection, or as it's called in IT, really, the concept of retrospectives is baked into the learning journey from the absolute start. And that's something that's a core skill that's used within software development or game development. It's really baking in those fundamentals into the curriculum from the very start. And for me, going back to the kind of example I gave of Julie Salmon's model, one of the final areas that we want to be looking at here is around preparing students for assessment. And I've seen time and time again where Elevate can be hugely valuable for peer review or developing those kind of assessment literacy skills. And I've given a few examples here, but the one that's shown on the screen is actually from an academic at Anglia Ruskin, Dr. Adrian Scruton, who asked students to peer review an ethics submission. And this was a fabulous project for me. This is a master's level course where many of the students haven't had to go through the kind of rigor of ethics submissions previously. And Adrian identified that there was a real problem with students' understanding on the ethics process. So he provided these students with the criteria that the ethics panel would use to review a submission. Asked the students to kind of engage with that and read that and refer to that as they were doing this task. And then actually he put up a previous submission that was obviously anonymized, and asked the students as a community to wear the hat of the ethics panel member and start to really question the language, the terminology, the ethical perspective on this content. And I think on this one resource, there ended up being something like 190 individual contributions that had been made from students for a cohort of around 30 to 40 students. But most importantly, these students were then able to go back to this and refer when they were writing their own submissions. Now, obviously, that has given them a real life opportunity to identify what's good and what's bad. But it means that they've got something to go back to. And that kind of concept works really nicely for assignments, dissertation submissions, all of that kind of stuff. And we've seen a number of examples of people using Elevate now for assignment submission, putting up everything from putting up what could be deemed as a bad assignment, a low graded assignment, in comparison to a very high graded assignment, and actually asking the students to review why they feel each one got 40 or 70 or whatever it is. And I'm sure within your subject disciplines there's a number of examples you could give there, and I can refer back to the example from Jasper Schultz earlier around diagnostic assessment. That kind of thing can be a really nice lead up to then this type of activity later on. So I wanted to give a couple of final thoughts around this kind of idea of deepening student engagement. For me, right now in particular, there's a really, I think it's even more important than ever that we give students flexible learning opportunities. We know that students won't all won't feel comfortable engaging with a certain type of activity. They may not be able to engage synchronously with a certain type of activity. And actually giving students a choice, I think, is more important than ever. And you can use this from an analytical perspective to gauge how you want to change your course and how you want to change your design and delivery moving forward. This is completely new for the vast majority of us. We are all learning this together, and actually this flexible learning approach could be hugely impactful in gaining an understanding of what our students prefer or are able to engage with more at this current time. And I'll refer to this example that Nina from the School of Pharmacology at Hertfordshire put up. She's using Elevate this year for a number of really exciting examples and use cases, which we'll be sharing over this coming term. But I think in this example, she gave students a choice of how to interact with this specific type of activity. The learning outcomes were exactly the same. It's just the task that was slightly different. So as you can see, collaboratively working on a Google Doc, or actually giving a whole group the opportunity to kind of work sequentially through a bunch of individual questions. And again, I'm not going to preach about how valuable that is, but I do feel that being flexible right now can be really helpful for our students and can be really helpful for our understanding of student preference. I've talked about this a lot, and I'm going to continue to talk about it until everyone agrees with me. I think that we are certainly observing now more than ever the value of using mixed media, and by that I mean not just presenting academic literature to our students, for example. We've seen a number of examples, again from across the community, where academics are introducing subject matter in a more kind of accessible, with a small a, approach through things like media. And I've given examples today around asking students to crowdsource content using different mediums as well. And for me, I think this is a really good thing to start getting into the habit of doing. Introducing tough subject matter in a slightly more accessible manner, i.e., through some content that could be visual aid, for example, or coming at the content from a slightly different perspective. And I think that we've seen some real value in this and some feedback from students has suggested that this can make the quite inaccessible content around academic literature, for example, much more accessible, and it's a great way of introducing the subject as well, as I've mentioned already. And I wanted to give a slightly more real-time example of this, actually. I really like this approach that's being adopted at in the School of Criminology at University of Lincoln. So Dr. Helen Nichols and her colleagues are using. I think she's on this webinar, actually. So Helen, please do write something if you want to add anything here. But in the School of Criminology, they've adopted this read, watch, listen approach to their design. So each week, the students are given a variety of resources to engage with, which is giving them a choice of and a wide perspective of the kind of content that relates to that week's subject matter. It gives the students the opportunity to develop their critical thinking across a number of different pieces of content. And I think, and as I've said already, it can make the content much more accessible. I think what's exciting for me with the use of Talis Elevate here, though, is that because you've got that mixed medium, and because the type of activity around collaborative annotation can exist across all of those mediums, there'll be a huge amount of value and learning that can take place about the cohort students in front of each academic, particularly on where the most activity occurs, where the knowledge and understanding is demonstrated or is not demonstrated, for example. And again, with that clear alignment towards the assessment, you're giving students a reference point to refer back to throughout all of this content. So I want to find sort of wrapping up now. I've talked about this previously, but for me, we need to be thinking quite a bit in our design at the moment around cognitive bandwidth, not just physical internet bandwidth. The example of this matrix on the right is talking about physical bandwidth, i.e. how much internet connection you've actually got. But you can expand this out to the kind of cognitive load that we're putting on our students. And I think it's really important to consider that kind of variety of activity that we're building into our design. So both finding the combination of the balance of synchronous and asynchronous activity, but also how much do we want our students to engage with activities we're building independently. How much of those are kind of small group activities, and how much of that is large cohort, the whole the whole cohort, regardless of how big it is. Finding that balance will meet the different desires of a number of different student preferences, really, around engagement with their peers, engagement with the learning process, etc. And I think now more than ever, it's really important to consider how time tight we're being with all of these tasks we're asking our students to do. So I don't really encourage at the best of times asking students to do something within 2 days, but right now we are really struggling, and our students are really struggling to find the time in many ways because of other commitments and other challenges that we're all facing. So obviously, giving students the breadth of time to engage with stuff we want them to do is more important than ever. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'm delighted to see that I've managed to keep this to half an hour again. In the next webinar, which will be next month, we will be covering the topic of understanding and utilising Talis Elevate analytics. So in this session, if you're using Talis Elevate now, you should have quite a bit of data that will be available within your modules. And what I'm going to go through is the kind of the approach that we've taken with our design in the presentation of Talis Elevate data. Some of the key things to remember when you're using any form of data to inform activity. And again, some examples of how our community are really making use of the insight they're gaining from Talis Elevate and the kind of questions that you can ask utilizing some of this data. We will be sending over the recording of this webinar after this session, and that will also contain a link to the next month's webinar. So please do sign up, and again, please do share with many of your peers. I will share this later on again, so I'll move off this slide now. Thank you very much for attending. As I've finished early, I'm more than happy to stay on the line if anyone's actually got any questions, comments, feedback, or actually just wants any help with anything they're doing with Talis Elevate. If not, you've gained half an hour back from your life. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully speak soon.